Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Happy Friday. Today is June 7th and we finally have some NBA action from the finals to dive into. We've been talking about it for what feels like weeks now, and we finally have something to actually analyze with Game 1 taking place last night and the Boston Celtics, for the most part, dominating the Mavericks in this game. So we are going to be diving into just a general recap of the game, talk about Jayson Tatum and the performance he had, whether or not the Celtics are going to need more from him in order to win this series, and what types of adjustments the Dallas Mavericks can make, because although this was a very substantial win for the Celtics, one thing we know in the NBA is these games can just be such a sort of ping pong effect where we get so caught up in the moment, but these teams can look entirely different in 48 hours. So I am definitely not ruling out the Mavericks moving forward here. So we're going to be talking all things Game 1, and then we are additionally going to touch on Adam Silver's press conference that he had with the media ahead of the game, specifically zeroing in on the conversation regarding the expansion of potential expansion, that is, of the league, and I will share some of my thoughts on that. And then finally, considering the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs are officially beginning tomorrow night on Saturday night, I want to share my thoughts and predictions on that. But before we get into everything, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our live viewers, be sure to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a tip or donation, you can leave a comment, which will appear on the screen. And again, we want to make this show as interactive as possible, so anything would be appreciated on that front. But again, if you are just trying to casually give us your thoughts on the show, no complaints there either. Be sure to use the comment section. The Celtics came out and really established themselves early in this game against the Dallas Mavericks, got out to a 29-point lead in the first half, and really, as much as we talked about, this has been a long time coming in terms of talking about this finals, because both the Eastern and Western Conference series were both finished up pretty quickly in the championship round, so we've known that this is going to be the matchup for a while, and we've known that Kristaps Porzingis was going to be one of, if not the biggest X factor in this series. He was cleared to play. He got hurt in Game 4 of the series against the Miami Heat, has missed the last 10 games for the Celtics, and he looked phenomenal for them in early on, specifically in this game, where he just went nuclear in the first quarter, showed basically his entire skill set on both sides of the ball, where you could see him sort of work himself into a rhythm on the offensive end. That sort of mid-range shot, specifically at the left elbow, is where he really seemed to, enjoy the matchup. And the height differential, as obvious of a thing as it is just such a mismatch for this Mavericks team that is very much predicated on their interior defense. The fact that Porzingis was just pulling up over defenders at the mid-range, knocking those down, and something that we saw from both Al Horford and Porzingis in this game was the ability to make the Mavericks respect their three-point shooting. Horford has been a little bit up and down in terms of his three-pointers throughout the playoffs so far, but he knocked down a couple right out of the gate. It was clear that the Mavericks were going to guard him on the perimeter. He got the ball in the corner. He gave Daniel Gafford a pump fake in, drove down the baseline for a dunk there as well. And then you have Porzingis, who comes off the bench in this game. Horford started in place of him. And on top of, pulling up in those mid-range shots, he also was extending the floor out to 29, 30 feet and letting it fly from there, which again is just something that the Mavericks defense I still do believe that they're excellent, but the way to beat the Mavericks, really, and we've been saying it through this entire postseason run, is you have to knock down your threes. And if you look at each of the matchups that the Mavericks have played up to this point, there has been a player that they can sort of hide their big man on in terms of not having to pull them all the way out. You go back to the Clippers series, their centers didn't have three-point spacing. Russell Westbrook also was somebody that they were very happy with letting shoot. You have Josh Giddey in the Thunder series. You have Rudy Gobert in the Timberwolves series. So again, just a lot of very prominent pieces of these teams that the Mavericks didn't feel like they had to go out and guard. And, obviously, again, Al Horford has had his ups and downs, so maybe he doesn't have it in one of these games, and that's something that the Mavericks will be sort of willing to live with. But it seems like, the way that the Celtics were able to drive into the paint themselves, and that was even with some sort of an intention of guarding the three-point line as well. The Celtics were just getting blow-bys after blow-bys. Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown both doing a really good job of getting into the teeth of the defense, and then Brown more so than Tatum finishing at the rim. Tatum was a little bit more dicey, you could say, in terms of the control of some of his passes, but at the same time, he made some incredible passes out of those drives as well. 6 turnovers definitely hurts him, but in general, I think both of these players did a really good job of getting to the rim and, just sort of, I wouldn't say exposing this Mavericks defense, but again, providing a different look that they haven't seen up to this point. And the Mavericks, as this always works, they're going to be the first team that has to make the adjustment. We'll see how the Celtics react to those adjustments as well. But I mentioned Jaylen Brown. He was... You can make a great argument that he was the highlight of this game, although in general, this was just a very team-centric win for the Celtics. Their top 6 players all in double digits, and there was, again, some really big impact plays on both sides of the floor from Jaylen Brown. You can throw Jrue Holiday in that conversation as well. I thought that this was just an incredible, top of the rotation performance from the Celtics, but Jaylen Brown in this game was the leading scorer with 22 points. Talked about his defense, 3 blocks and 3 steals. There was that point in the first half where Luka was just dribbling the ball up the court and Jaylen just stripped him clean and got an easy dunk there. But to that idea of Jrue as well, as much as the Celtics built up this 29-point lead, if you've been watching the NBA this year, eventually there is going to be that run on the other end that comes. And it really started at the end of the second quarter where the Mavericks sort of started to work their way back into it. The Celtics had some really sloppy offensive possessions, and then that sort of carried on over into the third quarter. And we saw the Mavericks get the lead, or the deficit, I should say, all the way down to 8. And that's when Luka was doing his best job of sort of getting inside. It was very clear, and we'll sort of talk about the strategy. The Celtics were very comfortable with letting Luka work one-on-one and trying to hold up. Now, some of the drives that he had, there was very little resistance, and, that individual defense has to be better. But in general, they were trying to take away the passing lanes for Luka, and he finished with just 1 assist, a season low, going back to the entire regular season as well. And the Mavericks only finished with 9 assists total in this game, which is just a couple sort of maybe silly numbers to throw out there, but the lowest amount of assists from a team in an NBA Finals game since 2007 with the Cavaliers. And the 9 assists was actually the same number of blocks that the Celtics had on the other end. And that is obviously not a winning recipe for the Mavericks. ultimately, I think that this was the Celtics showcasing how good they can be, and the Mavericks just didn't necessarily live up to expectations. And I do believe that the Celtics can still go up another level as well, because Jayson Tatum wasn't necessarily the best version of himself, and we're going to be diving into a more in-depth look of his performance and whether or not the Celtics need more from him in the following segment here. But before we dive into that, ultimately here, we have to talk about the fact that Jayson Tatum was receiving all of this extra attention, and you had these other players for the Celtics that stepped up, notably Jaylen Brown on offense, Kristaps Porzingis as well. But on the other side for the Mavericks, I wouldn't say that the Celtics didn't double Luka at all. Like, there were definitely, once he got into the paint, there was extra eyes on him, and there were always extra eyes on him, but it didn't feel quite as, intent as it was with the Mavericks on Jayson Tatum. But the fact that Kyrie Irving wasn't necessarily able to take over his side of the court the way that Jaylen Brown and these other players for the Celtics were, when they got those sort of those numbers matchups, you could say, with taking advantage of the double teams, having the other players step up. And there's a whole lot to break down in terms of the Mavericks offense. Obviously, there are some defensive adjustments as well, but the Mavericks just never really seemed to get into all too much of a rhythm, and in large part it was because of Kyrie Irving, who I think that him and Porzingis were sort of neck and neck for who is the player that has the most potential to swing this series. And I wouldn't say Kyrie was not good in this game. Ultimately, he got a number of good looks. He just missed the good looks. He had a lot more success actually, hitting those difficult shots. The one he hit in the first quarter where he was falling away outside of the paint and Al Horford got a hand on it, and Kyrie was just able to recollect himself and still get enough power on it to knock that down. It was incredible. But Kyrie in this game, we have seen him have some quieter scoring performances through the postseason, and ultimately I have defended him, especially if you go back to that Thunder series where he only averaged about 15 points per game. There were instances where even when he wasn't scoring, he was still having an impact on the game as a whole. I did not feel that he was sort of the chess player that he was in those Thunder series, and in large part, it's because the Celtics defenders did a much better job. The Mavericks were really trying to hunt out mismatches. Al Horford, I believe it was 19 possessions where he was the primary defender on the ball handler for the Mavericks, and on those 19 shots, it was something like they were held to 1. I know at least if you look at the numbers of Al guarding Luka Doncic, Luka was 1 of 8, 0 for 4 for 3 when Al Horford was that primary defender. It extends beyond that as well. Kristaps Porzingis was being hunted early on, especially from Luka. Sam Hauser, when he checked in the game, he had a very impactful game off the bench after really struggling there for at least the Eastern Conference Finals, but going back to Cleveland a little bit as well. So yeah, this series is by no means over, but we did see some of the, glaring issues that could prove to be fatal for the Mavericks. But before we dive into the adjustments that the Mavericks are going to need to make moving forward, I do want to talk about Jayson Tatum. Like I mentioned, the box score did not stand out for him by any means, but I do believe that he had an impact on the game, and I want to talk about whether or not the Celtics are going to need more of a traditional superstar performance from him from here on out in order to win the finals here. So we are going to be taking a quick break, and then we are going to dive into that conversation. Stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose if it's some moosey shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're talking about the Celtics Mavericks Game 1 matchup from last night, and the Celtics were in large part able to get this dominant win done without Jayson Tatum having a massive night for them. They built up a 10-point lead. I believe Tatum had only shot one shot at that point, hadn't scored, and it was already a double-digit lead, which just goes to show a couple things. Number one is the fact that the Celtics, I do believe, are, a better overall team than the Mavericks. Something that we were touching on at the end of last segment was the fact that, you can debate who the top four, rankings in this series are. We know it's Luka and Kyrie for the Mavericks, and we know that it's Tatum and Brown for the Celtics. But outside of, those players, again, group them however you'd like, the next handful of players, at least three, maybe four, probably three. That's at least where I had it in my player rankings earlier this week, are all Celtics. And we saw the impact of the Celtics, really that top six being as impactful as they were. And part of that is baked into this conversation with Jayson Tatum, where I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Tatum was great by any means, but people who are saying that he had a bad game either didn't watch the game and are just looking at the box score, or don't truly understand what is going on in these basketball games. Because Tatum, listen, again, I'm not trying to, get too high on him after a performance where he scores 16 points, he has 6 turnovers, and he's 6 of 16 from the field. But you can see every time he touches the ball on the perimeter, it is multiple guys swarming to him. That's how Kristaps Porzingis got a handful of his looks. And also, you look at the 5 assists that he had. I believe if you look at the advanced statistics, he had 14 potential assists as well. But specifically in that third quarter, Tatum was deferring a lot. And in that third quarter, when the Mavericks were starting to make the run, that is where you would prefer Tatum to sort of step up in a more aggressive way. But at the same time, he was making the right play just about every time. Now, the ball was sort of flying out of his hands on some of these passes, so that was definitely less than ideal, and that's something that he needs to clean up. But ultimately, I thought that his approach was extremely unselfish, and it was winning basketball. And it just feels like a lot of NBA fans are at a point where if you don't score 30 points, let alone 20 points, then you automatically had a bad game. But I just think that if you watch, there is clearly an impact that Tatum has that goes beyond the box score. And ultimately, like I mentioned, in those instances like the third quarter where shots aren't falling, and the Celtics were phenomenal shooting the three basically all night. And that is something that when the shots are falling like that, it's the perfect approach for Tatum, because he understands that he's going to get this extra level of attention. And every superstar, star, whatever you want to call it, in the NBA gets extra attention. There's, no denying that. This isn't some unheard of phenomenon. It's just the fact that Tatum is playing on a team that is able to actually cash out on these opportunities that he creates. The fact that nobody in the top 6, you can call it top 8 even if you want to extend it to Sam Hauser and Peyton Pritchard coming off the bench as well, none of them are liabilities from 3. So Tatum can spend all day driving, getting that extra attention, and the Celtics are going to have an open shot. The difference is that the Celtics, at least when they're hot and they're feeling themselves, can knock these down. You know, you talk about Jalen Brunson, who had, or you want to talk about Anthony Edwards as well. Both of these players are tremendous at getting inside the defense and finishing around the rim, but we saw the lack of spacing with the Knicks and the Timberwolves, where it seemed like Edwards and Brunson, if they weren't entirely putting the team on their back from a scoring perspective, their teams weren't going to win. Tatum is in a different situation. Listen, I know that plays right into the narrative that Jayson Tatum is on a super team and that he always has been. The Celtics are, I mean, you can make a case that they are super team-ish. Now, again, I think that term is vastly overused, but the Celtics have the best roster in the NBA. You know, they had 2 All-Stars this year, but Kristaps Porzingis, if he plays more games, he could have potentially been an All-Star. Derek White, Jrue Holiday, not quite at that level. Jrue has been in the past, but that's not necessarily who he is anymore in terms of the respect that he's going to gain nationally when his game is more predicated on sacrificing and focusing more on defense than on offense. But, you know, you can say that he's all-star caliber, and there's just a ton of talent surrounding Jayson Tatum to the point where I had no problems with the way that he played last night. I don't think that he looked quite as uncomfortable as it's being made out to. Now, again, some of the passes just flat out weren't good. And there was, you know, an instance where he was trying to post up Luka, and Luka just sort of, you know, nonchalantly poked it loose from him, which started a fast break the other way for the Mavericks. But, you know, ultimately, I think that this is the path for the Celtics to win, is Jayson Tatum being the hub of the offense, which I think that he was. And again, was it his most efficient game? No, I definitely wouldn't argue that. But at the same time, this is kind of the way that the Celtics want to play. Joe Mazzulla ball has always been about getting good looks from 3. And I wouldn't say fully living and dying by it. That's where you have some explosive athletes like Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Now, Tatum's finishing at the rim. The numbers actually, you know, make it seem better than it actually looks like, at least to me. He's shooting around 70% at the rim through the postseason so far. It feels like he leaves some opportunities there, at least watching. But again, I don't have all the numbers in front of me. But ultimately, again, I don't know if the eye test totally, you know, if the numbers totally back up the eye test to me in that sense. But we know that Tatum and Brown can drive when they like to, and they were just blowing by defenders all night, specifically Luka, and that's something that we're going to talk about in terms of the adjustments that the Mavericks are going to need to make. But they are getting to the rim, and Kristaps Porzingis, it's interesting. We saw it in the Miami series, even when he was playing. He doesn't get very deep in the post when he's doing these post-ups. He kind of settles for the long mid-ranges a little bit more. And last night, specifically in that first quarter, he was knocking them down, which is obviously great, but feels like you'd maybe want him a little bit closer to the rim. Now, a lot of the times when Porzingis had these guys on his back, it was the shorter defenders. It was Luka, it was Derek Jones Jr., that it isn't Gafford or Lively. There was that one possession where Porzingis was involved in the action around the free throw line where he sort of spun around Lively and got himself a dunk as he was hanging on the rim there. Definitely was a little bit of nerves going on in terms of how's it going to look when he lands. But my whole point to this little tangent is the fact that it feels like the Celtics shouldn't be quite as live and die by the 3. But that being said, in a perfect world, according to Joe Mazzulla, for the most part, it is trying to get these open 3-point looks. And that's what the Celtics were doing all night last night, except for in that third quarter where I thought that there was a little bit of a, time period there where Tatum was kind of settling for those outside shots maybe a little bit more. And he had, I think this was in the first half, but he had that pull-up three that he hit over Gafford as well. And I feel like typically I have a little bit of a problem with Tatum, who loves to shoot these threes over taller defenders, over these centers when he gets matched up against them. He actually, with the step back, got a really good look against Maxi Kleber, who still doesn't look totally comfortable out there in my eyes since returning from the dislocated shoulder injury. But, all this to be said, Tatum, I don't really care what his stat line looks like, and I am a Celtics fan, but ultimately I'm a Celtics fan. I'm not a Jayson Tatum fan, so I'm defending him because I feel like he is the most over-scrutinized player in the NBA. The Celtics have won by, massive margins all throughout the postseason, and the conversation has always been about, does Jayson Tatum need to do more? He is playing how his team needs him to right now, and there's a very clear reason why they have been able to have this success despite him not having these, crazy scoring outputs. And he still averaged 30 points per game in the Eastern Conference Finals. And obviously last night, not a big performance, but you saw him ramping up as the playoffs went on. Celtics are 5-0 so far, though, this postseason, with Tatum shooting under 40% from the field, which, again, if you are a Jayson Tatum fan in particular, not a great stat, but in general, I think it speaks to the Celtics and how loaded they are, and the fact that, yes, Tatum may not be, having the most efficient postseason of his career, but he is doing all of the right things in my eyes, and it is a large part of the reason why the Celtics are going to win the finals this year, at least in my eyes. But like I said, the NBA, we know how much of a back and forth type of league this could be. And as much as the Celtics looked like world beaters last night, the Dallas Mavericks still have the best player in the series in Luka Doncic, and they have plenty of talent. They have an awesome home court advantage. So there are things that the Mavericks can do, along with the Celtics not having the, scorching hot three-point shooting and perimeter shooting in general that they had last night. But the Mavericks are going to need to make adjustments, especially on that offensive end. So I want to dive into what things the Mavericks can do differently from here on out in order to take back this series. But before we do so, we're going to be taking a quick break. We will be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. The Dallas Mavericks definitely can't be feeling good after last night's game, but by no means are they going to be counting themselves out. And the Celtics, for, again, as awesome as that win was for them from their perspective, we saw the Mavericks at least provide that little bit of a spark in the third quarter that shows that it is not a massive gap in between. Celtics got off to a hot start, but once the game tightens up a little bit, the Mavericks do have a very real shot, and it's a good strategy for the Celtics to avoid getting into these crunch time possessions with the Mavericks, who have two of the, if not the two best closers in the game. But eventually, feels like the Celtics are going to have an off shooting night, and the Mavericks are going to be able to, stay in this and make things very interesting. So I want to talk about the adjustments that the Mavericks can make going forward here, because there were some clear issues with the team last night, and it stems from their offense, which just was not good enough. 89 points, like I mentioned, only 9 assists, tied for the least amount of assists in an NBA Finals game by a singular team since the Cavaliers in the 2007 Finals. So that obviously has to be better. And obviously, the eyes are on Luka Doncic last night, who had just 1 assist. And it was very clear that the Celtics, while they were obviously having that extra set of attention on Luka, they weren't sending these extreme double teams and, heavy blitzes in the way that the Timberwolves were, that the Thunder were, that opened up all of these other wide open shots on the perimeter for the Mavericks. And in a very large part of that, as well as the fact that the Mavericks have benefited this season very much in large part due to the corner shots falling for them. They were top 4 in the NBA in terms of shots from the corner in the league this past season, and we saw that number even go up a bit throughout the playoffs. During the regular season, 10.1 3-point attempts from the corner. That was 4th in the league, and that is now at 11.2 through the playoffs. Last night they had just 3, and we have seen a very drastic fall off in terms of the 3-point percentage from PJ Washington and Derek Jones when they are shooting above the break versus in the corner. And that's something where ultimately, the percentages have not been good. It does feel like they're going to have to at least take those shots and try and get the Celtics to respect it a little bit more. I mentioned just PJ and Derek Jones there, but there was an instance, I believe it was in the second quarter, where the Celtics did send the double team at Luka, and it was the second player coming off of Josh Green, who was standing wide open on the wing. He decided he wasn't going to shoot that. He took a couple dribbles in. The Celtics still didn't close out on him, and he ends up shooting this little bit of an awkward runner and missing it there. And it was just, I thought, a little bit of a microcosm of what we are seeing in general, at least as things currently stand. I don't want to say the series as a whole because we've only seen one game, but it feels like the Celtics are going to be looking to take away those corner threes in particular, live with stuff above the break. We've seen that be their strategy a little bit in general here throughout the postseason. We saw it with the Cavaliers and with the Miami Heat when both of those teams got hot from 3 and were able to steal the game 2s from the Celtics, and that was at least the strategy last night. The Mavericks need to not question whether or not those are good looks. PJ Washington, Derek Jones, I know it's not their number one hope to take those looks, but feels like you have to sort of take the wide open looks that the Celtics give you and hope that you can convert better. And that's not this, a foolproof plan, because obviously you're playing a numbers game at that point, and if PJ and Derek Jones can't hit, then you are just sort of throwing possessions away. I understand that. It's more than just that, but that is one thing that I'm definitely looking at if I am the Mavericks. Part of the other issue with the Mavericks in general is the fact that I felt like they were very much trying to hunt these mismatches. We saw Al Horford going through all of this extra attention when he was on the defensive end. And as we get a comment from Kelsey, Celtics in 6, that was the prediction going into this. I don't know if I'm going to waver just yet. I mean, it feels a little bit more in favor of the Celtics now. But again, Mavericks are too good of a team to just roll over. But their offense is going to need to have some more ball movement to it. And listen, I understand Luka and Kyrie are really the only players on the Mavericks that you fully trust from a ball handling perspective, but at the same time, it was just so much ISO ball of trying to hunt out these mismatches. We saw Al Horford, like we talked about, I believe he was put into 18 different possessions on defense as the primary defender, and he held up incredible. He had a couple blocks in that game as well, both on Kyrie Irving and against Luka, for the way that he was able to hold up. And that's something we talked about as well. As much as Al was getting exposed throughout the Eastern Conference run with those quick guards and Donovan Mitchell and Tyrese Halliburton, Luka doesn't necessarily, he's a much more patient player, and he doesn't necessarily have the quick burst to, get those tough angles. And we saw Kyrie at one point sort of shake Al Horford in the corner, and he ended up getting himself a baseline drive and finished with that reverse layup. So I'm not saying that Al can't, be exploited to some degree, but it was just very heavily centered around that. And it was Sam Hauser when he checked in. Luka went at him the first two possessions that Hauser was on the court, and he came away with stops, including a steal there. Luka was looking for Kristaps Porzingis as well, who I believe also got a block on him, or at least forced a bad miss. But, a lot of very Luka and Kyrie, putting the ball on the floor, and Kyrie even less so. Maybe that's something to think about more. Now, Jrue Holiday was obviously a menace in this game. As Kelsey says, Al plays great at age 52. Just about. Not quite that, I believe. Did he just turn 38? I know that his birthday was like first week of June. He may have just turned 38, actually. Yeah, he did. His birthday was June 3rd, so earlier this week. So it sometimes feels like he's 52. But I mean, man, is he held up to this point. And that it's not a good sign if you are the Mavericks and you feel like that's the place to exploit the Celtics and he's holding up the way that he does. Definitely not a good sign there. And I'm not necessarily sure what it is. We see with the Celtics, it's Jayson Tatum driving, and granted, this again goes back to the conversation of how much extra attention are these teams willing to give up on these types of drives. The Jayson Tatum was able to kick it out, and they would swing it all around the perimeter and end up with a good shot. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's that the Celtics aren't putting that much pressure on Luka inside, and maybe that means that he needs to sort of go into that extra level of aggression. I mean, he scored 30 points last night, so it's not like he wasn't making them hurt at all. Ultimately, I think it sort of falls on Kyrie as well, who needs to get himself some good looks. It's tough with the size that the Celtics have, though, as well, where, Kyrie is typically the smallest player on the floor when both teams' starting fives are out there. So I think that they need to start making the Celtics pay Luka and Kyrie, that is, on the interior in order to force them into giving up that extra attention and then allowing some more open looks on the perimeter. But I mentioned the corner threes. One of the other biggest parts of the Mavericks offense has been throwing lobs to Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford, and the Celtics obviously knew this, and their strategy coming into this game was having Jayson Tatum match up against the bigs so that in these pick and roll situations you weren't getting a big that can be exploited in the same way, sort of like what we saw Rudy Gobert just being stuck in no man's land basically that entire Western Conference Finals, not knowing whether or not to step up more against Kyrie and Luka, and then having that lob lane open in the back, or if he doesn't step up, the two of them would make them pay. The Celtics were in large part willing to sort of drop back with Jayson Tatum, who is a little bit more of a flexible defender. And obviously, again, there should be a size mismatch, but I just thought that the Celtics did an incredible job of limiting those pick and roll opportunities and getting bigs in compromising positions. Porzingis was playing a lot of this game, him and Al Horford both sort of on the Derek Jones types. And again, if they are outside of the break, not in the corner, but beyond the three-point line, Celtics were sort of willing to give up those types of opportunities. And, I think the Celtics had a perfect defensive game plan in order to shut down the Mavericks. They're going to have to try and overcome that. In terms of defense, they were playing just about as well as I wouldn't say fully just about as well as they could. There were open looks that were happening. I would maybe consider sort of giving Tatum a little bit more room and seeing whether or not he is going to hurt you. That's obviously a very risky strategy in terms of giving the other team's best player more looks, but that's kind of what the Celtics did to Luka in this game, took away the playmaking, and ultimately we saw the Mavericks offense just look so much more disjointed. Kelsey asks, do you think Porzingis will play that good all series? In terms of what he did in the first quarter, that was a legacy quarter for Porzingis. Whatever he was, 4 of 5 or something from the mid-range. That is a pretty big ask, and the defensive impact that he had as well, though, is something that I don't think is going anywhere. The rim protection that he was playing, and that's where Celtics, because they had Tatum guarding the big man, and the big man on Dallas can't necessarily take advantage of smaller defenders in a post-up situation. Gafford did a really good job of cleaning up on misses and such, and that's another thing sort of baked into this is if that's the way that the Celtics are going to play, the Mavericks have to win the offensive rebound battle, which we saw. They definitely had their opportunities. Like I mentioned, Daniel Gafford was impactful on the offensive glass. He got a number of putback looks for himself doing that, but the Celtics also out-rebounded them on the offensive glass on the other end. So I think rebounding is going to be a very big part of the Mavericks game plan if they're going to try and turn this thing around, that they have to be ultra aggressive on that glass, put Tatum in compromising positions if he's going to be matched up against your big men, because as things stand right now, Kristaps Porzingis can sort of play that roamer role, help to, contest things at the rim, but on those second opportunities is where things can definitely open up for the Mavericks. And, it's very doable. In large part, it's hitting their own shots, and it is, winning the offensive glass. So a lot of it is sort of simple, but at the same time, and you can say from the defensive end as well, the point of attack defenders just have to be better. Way too many blow-bys for the Celtics to get into the paint, which allowed the ball movement to open up for all of these different three-point opportunities. Lil Fettuccine asks, is Boston going to sweep? I don't think so. At some point, it feels like the Celtics' shots aren't going to fall. They were, going nuclear in that first quarter when they scored 37 points. And it took the Mavericks until, I put it down somewhere in my notes here, that it was off that Maxi Kleba drive with 1:26 left in the second quarter for the Mavericks to even match that first quarter total for the Celtics. But then the Mavericks were in large part able to work their way back into the game when the Celtics threes weren't falling as much, as when they sort of get caught up in their own shot selection tendencies, which do tend to hurt them at times. So ultimately, I think that the Celtics are due to have a bad night shooting from three. Now, they are capable to win these types of games. I think that's one of the biggest differences from last year's Celtics to this year's, that the Celtics do have options attacking the interior of opposing defenses, but at the same time, that is sort of the Mavericks' specialty as well, which sort of is all baked into that conversation. Is the series going to 7? My initial pick headed into this series was Celtics in 6. I feel pretty good about that, but obviously, again, you can't necessarily just judge off of one game. It would be foolish for me to start doing a victory lap now in terms of feeling good about my pick, because these teams can look entirely different. It's interesting that the NBA decided to schedule this out, that game 2 isn't going to be until Sunday, which, you can sort of manufacture all of these different scenarios in which it would favor one team over the other. Ultimately, though, it's the Mavericks who do sort of need this probably extra day, I think, to, reconsider their approach. And eventually, there's going to be a close game in this series. And if that's the case, you do have to, if you're a Celtics fan, really worry about the late game offense of Dallas versus the Celtics. And that isn't even a statement on the Celtics. I think that they showed during the Pacers series that they can actually pull out some of these close games, and that mentally. And Jaylen Brown had a quote after the game saying that once the deficit got down to 8 in the third quarter, that's when the game actually started. And it shows the mental maturity from the Celtics. I don't think that they are, handicapped in the same way that they have been in the past, but it's Luka and it's Kyrie. In a closing situation, there really isn't an option to fully shut that down. So ultimately, I still lean with the Celtics on this one. Maybe it sways me to feeling like this could be a 5-game series as opposed to 6, but again, after just one game, you can't necessarily go back and, change your entire gut feeling about the entirety of it. So it's going to be an uphill battle for the Mavericks to overcome what the Celtics put out last night. But I do think that it's still possible. Again, Luka being the best player in the series is a massive factor. But that being said, they're going to need other players to step up. The Celtics role players are superior to the Mavericks role players, and ultimately, as much as we spend so much time, and you look at the national media conversation, and it's been all about, well, Luka's the best player. Some people, and I never agreed with it, that Kyrie could be better than Jaylen Brown or Jayson Tatum. Even if that is the case, which I don't think so, it's still a team game. And obviously, the NBA is the most star-powered league out of any of the major professional sports in America. But at the same time, there is a real team element. The Celtics have talked about sacrifice all year long. And it's going to be really hard to shut down the entirety of really that top 6 in particular, plus whatever other performances you can get off of the bench if you are the Celtics. But that is all we have time for on this segment. I want to, though, talk about the comments that Adam Silver made prior to the game starting in the media situation. So we're going to dive into that. But first, one last comment here from Kelsey. People kept saying the West would crush any Eastern Conference team. Listen, we can admit multiple things here. The Western Conference was undoubtedly more talented than the Eastern Conference was this season. Way deeper. But we can also agree that the Celtics were never really grouped in with those other Eastern Conference teams. That this was the Celtics conference all year long. And there was really never a point, I know that there was some love for the Knicks, especially around mid-season, where they made those acquisitions where everybody, including myself, I think I was fooled a little bit just based off of we all wanted, something interesting to happen at the trade deadline. Ultimately, it was the Mavericks who made out the best out of it, but the Celtics were never in competition with those other Eastern Conference teams. And, the Mavericks probably would, crush the majority of teams that made the playoffs in the East. Celtics are a different conversation, though. And that's why, for as much as this conversation of being battle-tested was thrown out in these conversations basically for the past month plus, the Celtics did exactly what we expected them to do, which is go 12-2 in the Eastern Conference, look dominant for the majority of stretches, and now here they are in the finals, and a great start for them. But we are going to be taking a quick break now, and when we come back on the other side, want to dive into those comments from Adam Silver and the idea of the NBA expanding. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We've talked a lot of NBA Finals from last night, but we did also have some very interesting comments from the NBA Commissioner Adam Silver in regards to a number of different topics regarding the league. And the one that caught the most people's eyes was the idea of the NBA looking to expand. Now, this has been a thought process for years now that the league could look to add one or two, most likely, teams and bump it up to 32 total teams. And Silver talked about it last night. Now, one of the bigger concerns that he laid out was the idea of the NBA. It seems like right now, and listen, there's always going to be that bottom feeder team, but I still do look at a team like the Pistons, and I personally am way higher on the upside of the Pistons than I feel like the majority of people. The Pistons are at least a team, I feel like just about every team in the league, not to fire an unfair shot here, pretty much every team except for the Washington Wizards, I believe has a player on the roster that would be worth paying money to go see, because I'm a big fan of player development and seeing some of these young stars, how they react and such, and, you know, grow up over time, that I think that every team has, you know, this promising young piece. Again, not to sort of diss the Wizards. I like Denny Avdia, if there are any Wizards fans out there that would be upset with that statement. But ultimately, you know, Adam Silver talked about the dilution of talent if they were to add another 35 players in the NBA, and having that, you know, further contribute to a potential issue in a league where tanking has been a really big, as Kelsey says, Hickory Ridge, Arkansas needs a team. Not sure about Hickory Ridge, but I mean, part of it, and I want to continue on that thought, but part of it was interesting that Silver did talk about the possibility of adding another Canadian team, which we'll sort of come back around to, but just to the idea of the, you know, talent being broken up evenly into the NBA. I think that that's another big conversation in terms of the second luxury tax apron that was implemented in the last collective bargain agreement from the Players Association in the league, that teams are going to have a much harder time building up these, you know, super team rosters because of the different handicaps that you get, not being able to combine multiple smaller contracts into one big contract, the way that it impacts the free agents that you can sign, the veteran minimum deals, the buyout contract guys. There's all these different, you know, numbers of restrictions that are put onto a team that's in the second apron. So that is something that maybe was a little bit far-sighted when they put it in, with the idea that expansion would be coming sometime soon. So it's something to think about. Ultimately, his concerns are fair because, again, as much as I'm a very big NBA fan, in the 2010s, we saw half of the league just about tanking every single season, and that's why we saw a number of, rules come into the NBA in terms of them loosening up and more evenly distributing the lottery odds so that it sort of makes losing out less favorable. We've seen the Pistons in back-to-back years now have the number one odds, at least tied for the number one odds, to get the number one overall pick, and they've fallen outside of the top 4 to pick number 5. And we've seen the play-in tournament, which a lot of people don't like, but at the same time it does keep some of these teams that are sort of middling at least in the conversation of, hey, we could actually make the playoffs right now, so let's not trade basically our entire roster at the trade deadline and bottom out for the rest of the year. So it's something that the NBA is clearly very conscious of, and that was sort of my takeaway from Silver's comments on that end. That being said, I do feel like we are getting to a point where we haven't seen, this much talent in the NBA ever, that there is a lot of depth on a lot of these teams. And listen, obviously, like I said, you are always going to have bad teams, but I think that the league would be sort of in a better position to at least, have some layer of competence on these expansion teams. Now, it's interesting to see where these teams could end up on that other front, because again, expansion, I think, is something that is inevitable with the NBA, with how much money they make, understanding they can work their way into new markets. I feel like that is going to happen at some point. Now, Silver talked about, Seattle and Las Vegas being named as possible cities, but Kelsey said Vancouver in the comment section. I mean, Vancouver had a team all those years ago with the Grizzlies, where they were once located in Vancouver. I think that would be a pretty reasonable spot there that could fit in for Canada as well if they wanted to. The NBA has had this intent of trying to expand the game beyond the American borders for years now, where they are very proactive with their NBA academies overseas. I believe there's at least one in Africa and at least one in Australia. Definitely, if I'm mistaken on those, be sure to use the comment section, let me know. But it's definitely a movement that the NBA is trying to put into place, is at least growing the game of basketball all over the world. And we are seeing the fact that we are seeing I'm not sure if I can read that comment out loud, Kelsey, but that is funny. But I think that ultimately here, we're seeing this international revolution of stars in the NBA. You look at Luka and Jokic and Giannis, Embiid, etc., etc. We're entering a phase and an era possibly of NBA stars, many of them coming from overseas. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander from Canada as well. And it is really cool to see. I would love to, have basketball grow internationally, have the Olympics sort of become this, bigger thing. Obviously, it's a whole conversation about, why is it called world champions in the NBA if you're only playing teams in America? All the best players in the world are coming to the NBA, and I don't know, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I just think that it's something that, again, and we're seeing, as Kelsey brings up, the NFL playing these games in the UK and in Mexico. I'm not sure exactly, I don't know if it's expansion necessarily to try and go across borders, but obviously, the NFL especially is the most, America central sport that outside of the US there really isn't much interest, and that's why you see way more foreign stars in the NBA than you do in the NFL. The international stars in the NFL aren't really a thing, and I think that the NFL just wants to see, again, there are all types of financial implications if the game can grow to a point where everybody in the world is watching their sport. That's why you see, the contracts with European soccer is unbelievable how much these clubs and these players make. And I think that's probably a little bit of the motivation for these American sports leagues trying to expand across borders as well. But one other thing I sort of briefly wanted to, two things, I guess. Adam Silver talked about Caitlin Clark in the WNBA. He was specifically asked about the hit that Kennedy Chandler put on her. This was over the weekend, Saturday, one of the two. And it was a dirty play. It wasn't egregious or anything. It was just a hip check, a hard hip check, but it's not like it was anything that put Caitlin Clark, in any type of real injury risk. I would say that Silver said, listen, welcome to the league, moments happen, and that's cool. Dirty hits is where you obviously draw the line, and it should be within the framework of the sport that these types of instances have. So that I just found a little bit interesting that he gave some thoughts, and also the fact we've had a little bit of varying opinions surrounding the 65 game rule in terms of NBA players being eligible for regular season awards. Ultimately, I do think it was a success for the most part that we saw, the least amount of load management than we have in years. It does obviously get a little bit dicey when you have somebody like Embiid who probably wasn't playing fully healthy in the first place and then tried to keep going, and he ends up tearing his meniscus in his other knee. Again, who knows whether or not the correlation is there, but Embiid was, had missed a number of games just prior to that as well. And because some of these All-NBA awards are tied into contracts and how much players are eligible to make, it does make things a little bit dicey. But ultimately, I like the idea of the 65 game rule. Maybe it could be reduced slightly, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. We are going to be taking our final break of the show though, and when we come back on the other side, the Stanley Cup Finals are beginning tomorrow night. And we had a little bit of a technical difficulty yesterday when we were previewing that. So I want to come back around and make my official prediction for the Stanley Cup Finals. But first, a quick break. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day. I want to talk some Stanley Cup Finals predictions here. The puck drops officially tomorrow night between the Panthers and the Oilers, and it should be very exciting to tune into and see how this plays out. I have the feeling that we are going to have a very physical series on the line here. The Panthers, that's always been their reputation to some degree, is having that level of physicality, and it seemed like the Oilers sort of wanted to play that game a little bit more than the Stars did in the Western Conference Finals. So I think that this, really has the potential of being an incredible finals. And, that's talking from a physicality standpoint, but also the fact that we have Connor McDavid, the best player in the NHL, finally making his debut on the biggest stage. And I think that this is something that's really important. In the NHL, I think that they definitely struggle in terms of marketability of stars to some degree, and I don't know what the solution to that would be. But ultimately, getting to see Connor McDavid in the finals, considering the history of that Edmonton franchise and some of the greats that have sort of preceded him, Mark Messier and obviously Wayne Gretzky, being in this position now. Win or lose for the Oilers, it's a win for the NHL that we see Connor McDavid on this biggest stage. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday when we had the other hosts on here, that the legacy of Connor McDavid, this is a situation where in the NBA we get so caught up in this legacy, make or break type series. The reality in most cases, I would say, in the NBA, even though we choose to be so much more negative about it, the NHL is just an example here where this is, the Oilers can get swept, and this is an incredible thing for the league because McDavid is going to have a massive impact on this type of a series. And thank you, Kelsey, for the support. Have a great weekend yourself. But McDavid, we saw the performances that he had in the Western Conference Finals, specifically in that closeout game for the Oilers, where they were massively outshot in that game, only had 10 shots on net, but both of the goals that they produced came from McDavid with one of the prettiest playoff goals you are going to see in some time, weaving his way around defenders, the toe drag, flipping it up top right corner, just was beautiful all around. And then very shortly after, we saw him gaining that extra attention, the Oilers on the power play, and him drawing, again, in an already shorthanded lineup for the Stars, getting that extra attention, dumping it off to Hyman, who scored from the slot. So his fingerprints were all over that game. And even if you want to go in terms of, some of the hustle plays that he was making, I mean, we just know how great Connor McDavid is all around, and it's good that he's going to get the national stage now and, be put on a little bit of a higher pedestal. But I just mentioned the fact that the power play for the Oilers was really impactful for them in that Game 6 closeout. That is going to be, I think, special teams will be the biggest X factor in this series, because you're talking about Edmonton, who through the postseason has had the number one power play and the number one penalty kill. And early on in that Western Conference Finals against the Stars were doing a really good job of holding off the power play from Edmonton, and that in turn, we've seen, I wouldn't say the Oilers struggle in 5-on-5, but they obviously, make their money off of their power play. And that wasn't happening, and things were harder for them. And then, the Stars were at least competitive in that series. But ultimately, Oilers were able to turn it on down the stretch of the series. They are definitely going to need power play looks, and they're going to need to convert to match up against this Panthers team, which I would say is deeper than the Oilers are. I know then the Oilers were having some success with their third line down the stretch of that Western Conference Finals series as well. So I'm not saying, I think it's just going to be a massive deal for them. And on the other side, the Panthers have the number 2 penalty kill in the playoffs so far as well. So both going to be a really big deal. And then the other X factor is going to be Stuart Skinner, the goaltender for the Oilers, who has definitely had some shaky moments throughout the postseason, has been pulled on a couple of occasions, but ultimately he put in his best performance of the postseason in Game 6 against Dallas, and that is something that they are absolutely going to need, because if he has some type of a clunker, the Panthers are going to be able to take advantage of that in the moment and likely build off of it. Now, again, the response from Skinner after he's been under so much pressure and so much scrutiny. I mean, you can say that about the Oilers team as well. You want to talk about Nurse as well, the defenseman, and the way that he has been very heavily criticized because of how much money he gets paid in comparison to his performance early on, which was a little bit of an unfair conversation. But he really turned himself around, and you go to really the beginning of the Western Conference Finals series, where the Stars went to double overtime with the Oilers, and the fact that in that first overtime period, McDavid picks up a penalty right out of the gates there, and then the response, he gets a great look at the end of the period, that doesn't fall, but he responds right at the beginning of the second. And coming off of their 7-game series against the Canucks, being down 2-3 in that series, pulling that off, coming into a massive Game 1 against the Stars, just all of it together, we know this Oilers team is ready to compete. And a little bit of a disappointing loss in the postseason last year, but now they're here. And definitely wouldn't say disappointing in general for the Panthers last year, but they have some unfinished business, of course, after making the finals last year, losing to the Golden Knights. They feel like they have a redemption story on their hands here. And ultimately, I think that the difference in goaltending is going to be the biggest thing. Bobrovsky going toe-to-toe with Igor Shesterkin in the previous series. Shesterkin, one of, if not the best goaltender in the league. That I have the Panthers in this series. I have it going 6. Now, as a Bruins fan partially, and also just, with the overall likability of that Oilers team, the fan base, and wanting to see Connor McDavid as well, and you got to give some love to Leon Draisaitl too, but ultimately, I'm rooting for the Oilers in this series. Not that I'm going to be, super invested in the Oilers in particular, but I just think that would be the best story possible, although the Panthers have just been a wagon, and I think that they're the best team. I've been saying it for a couple rounds now, that they are just so tough, and I ultimately think that this is theirs to lose. Very quickly here, because we do have to wrap this up, I'm curious if I can pull up any type of some odds here, because I would have to imagine that the Oilers are going to be favored in this series, or the Panthers, that is. I should have had this pulled up beforehand, and if I can't, then so be it. But looking on FanDuel very quickly here, it appears that we have, it's going to take too long to load. So here it is. We got the series odds. We don't have the series odds. Okay, well, forget it. I would imagine the Panthers are probably favored in this series. If I'm wrong on that, be sure to let me know. But I think it should be a really good series in general anyways. Definitely let me know your thoughts on the upcoming series. Again, puck drops Saturday night, so be tuned in for that. But as for now, that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. Have yourselves a great weekend, and we will see you Monday afternoon at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet.